Hey, my name is Chris Brennan from the Astrology Podcast, and this is your horoscope for the entire year ahead for 2021 for Virgo and Virgo rising. So, this is primarily a rising sign horoscope, although you can also look at it if your sun sign is Virgo or if your moon sign is Virgo, although rising or ascendant sign is definitely preferred because that's going to be more personal to you and your birth chart. All right, let's go ahead and jump right into it. So here's the planetary movements calendar for 2021 that shows where the planets start at the beginning of the year and how far through the signs of the zodiac they'll get by the end of the year. And here's some of the major points that I wanted to talk about today in terms of your major outer planet transits for 2021. So Saturn and Jupiter recently moved into Aquarius, where they formed the Great Conjunction in December of 2020. And this is a shift into your sixth house of health and work. So one of the good things about this is that the long fifth and eighth house transits that you were experiencing during the majority of the year of 2020 are now over. So the fifth house transit was Saturn transiting through Capricorn and through your fifth house of children, creative expression, sex, and sexuality. That started way back in December of 2017, and that is now finished as of December of 2020. Additionally, there was a 6-month-long Mars retrograde period that started halfway through 2020, and that lasts all the way until January of 2021. So that means you are just ending that as we are getting started with this year once Mars moves into Taurus on January 6th. So Aries for you, where Mars went retrograde in the second half of 2020, was your eighth house of shared resources, other people's money, mortality. It can also pertain to taxes and debts and things like that. So for some of you, that may have coincided with a period in which there was some strife or some tensions in that area of your life. But part of the good news is that that tension is over now that Aries is moving out of that sign. All right, so Jupiter and Saturn conjoining and moving through Aquarius. This is the start of a 3-year transit of Saturn through Aquarius and through your sixth house of health, service, and work, as well as subordinates. So here's my little diagram that has the significations of the houses according to traditional astrology. And for some of you, this is going to coincide with the period, since it is a 3-year transit, where there may be some obstacles or some setbacks where it comes to either health issues or issues involving work and whatever it is that you do for work if you're in a role that's sort of subordinate to somebody else, where you have a boss, for example. So some of these obstacles and difficulties over the course of the next few years may just be annoyances, whereas some of them may be surmountable difficulties where if you push forward enough, you'll be able to get through it and come out the other side stronger than you were when you started. In other instances, it may cause you to run into sort of a wall where you can't proceed further. And while that may not be a very fun process at the time, in some instances, it may allow you in the end to go in an alternative direction that you wouldn't have gone otherwise if you hadn't gotten that stop sign that sort of said that you couldn't proceed further. So that is a 3-year transit. You should have gotten a bit of a preview of it last year between late March and early July of 2020, when Saturn first dipped into Aquarius during that time. And that may have been a more difficult preview because Mars would have been transiting through and conjoining Saturn during its initial phase of that transit at the same time. So it could have been kind of tough. So while that was a preview, it was kind of a preview of some of the more difficult aspects of Saturn going through your sixth house over the course of the next 3 years. One of the good things about 2021, though, by comparison, is that Jupiter will be transiting through that sign for about a year, which is really going to help to balance and offset Saturn in a much more positive way. So Jupiter can be much more optimistic and much more growth-oriented, so it could be a period in which you're able to rectify some health issues or in which you're able to have some optimism or some growth and expansion when it comes to your work or things that you do in which either you're in a subordinate role for other people, or perhaps where if you have people that work for you or under you in some capacity, where you have some benefits from them. So that Jupiter transit's really going to help offset some of the Saturn stuff during the course of 2021, I think. Other transits that I wanted to talk about and touch base on, one of them is Uranus transiting through Taurus, which is your ninth house of education and philosophy and travel, is going to be squaring Saturn this year at different points. There's going to be 3 exact squares. So that may indicate some tensions between some of these ninth house topics that have been coming up over the course of the past couple of years as Uranus is transiting through that sign, where some of those themes could be things like sudden unexpected disruptions with respect to your education or with respect to your philosophical or religious beliefs, where you may be adopting some ideas and going in some directions educationally or philosophically that are quite out of the ordinary or very unexpected for you given your own background and initial trajectory. But nonetheless, they may be positive developments in the long term, even if they're a little bit destabilizing initially. So for some reason this year, there's a tension between some of those developments with Uranus transiting through your ninth house of education and philosophy, and Saturn transiting through your sixth house of work and health, and somehow a tension between those two areas that could come to a head at different points during the course of 2021. So there's going to be 3 exact squares of Saturn and Uranus, and especially if you have placements around 7 to 13 degrees of the fixed signs, I think this could be very personally tied in with your birth chart and with some events this year. So the first Saturn-Uranus square is around mid-February. The second Saturn-Uranus square is around mid-June. And then finally, there's one more exact Saturn-Uranus square that occurs on December 24th at 11 degrees of Aquarius and 11 degrees of Taurus. So there's going to be different points during the course of the year when Mars moves through the fixed signs, and it may exacerbate or act as a sort of trigger point for some of those tensions in between those two areas of your life. One of them is when Mars moves through Taurus. It's going to square Saturn and conjoin Uranus between January 13th and January 20th. Taurus, for you, of course, with Virgo rising, is your ninth house of education and philosophy and travel. The second flashpoint this year is later when Mars moves into the fixed sign of Leo, which is your 12th house, and Mars will oppose Saturn July 1st and then square Uranus on July 3rd. And then finally, there's going to be one more fixed sign transit for Mars when it goes through Scorpio, which is your third house of communication, between November 10th and November 17th. It's going to form exact aspects with Saturn and Uranus one more time this year. So this could be important trigger points in terms of that tension between your ninth house of education and philosophy and your sixth house of work and health to pay attention to during the course of this year. All right, so other topics that I wanted to touch on this year are the eclipses that are taking place in your 10th house of career, your 4th house of home and living situation, and your 9th house of education and travel. So we can see, here's a little chart that lists the dates for the eclipses. So there's a lunar eclipse in Sagittarius May 26th, and it's paired with a solar eclipse in Gemini on June 10th. So this, of course, is important for you because Gemini is your 10th house of career, reputation, social standing, and overall life direction. And having a lunar eclipse take place, a solar eclipse take place there on June 10th is going to be a major beginning where you're going to experience major beginnings and major endings in that sphere of your life. So paired with that is a lunar eclipse that's taking place in Sagittarius, which is going to put a spotlight on your home and living situation around the time of May 26th, and in that range within about a month. So what's activated here is actually not something new. It's actually a continuation of an eclipse series that started in 2020, possibly going back to June of 2020, but especially by late November of 2020, there was an eclipse in Gemini in your 10th house. And on December 14th of 2020, there was a solar eclipse in Sagittarius in your 4th house of home and living situation. So this is an entire period, about a year and a half period, where the eclipses are just bouncing back and forth between the house that represents your public life and the house that represents your private life. And so there's going to be some restructuring in those areas and great endings as well as great beginnings, where you're starting and ending new things in those two spheres of your life and coming to a better realization how they're not as separate as they seem, but in fact, your public life and your private life are very intimately interconnected. And when there's a major change in one, sometimes that can affect a major change in the other at the same time. So starting and stopping jobs or a new major career direction and going in a life direction, having starting and stopping or starting a new project at home in terms of your home and living situation, or with respect to people in your home, such as your parents or other family members, can be major, pretty standard, straightforward significations when you start having eclipses take place in the 4th and 10th houses. So that's the first eclipse hits that take place in the second quarter of the year. The other set of eclipses happened later in the year in November and early December. So this is first a partial lunar eclipse that happens in Taurus in your 10th house of education and philosophy and travel on November 19th. And then there's a total solar eclipse December 4th in Sagittarius back in your 4th house of your home and living situation. So on the one hand, I believe that's the final eclipse in the Sagittarius Gemini eclipse series. So whatever the circumstances surrounding your home and living situation are that are coinciding with that eclipse, that should bring them to some sense of completion at that time in December. But the eclipse in Taurus is opening up a whole new eclipse series that's going to become much more prominent in 2022, when you get a whole series of eclipses bouncing back and forth between your 9th house of education and your 3rd house of communication and travel. So the Taurus one is one to pay attention to because it may represent some sort of culmination or some sort of shift in focus more towards 9th house activities that really picks up later in the year in terms of your personal belief system becoming more important and gaining more focus. And then eventually in 2022, you're going to have to learn how to communicate some of those things that you've learned and some of those new directions that you've gone in terms of your personal philosophy as a result of the Taurus eclipses in your 9th house. But it's really something that just starts getting going at the very tail end of 2021. And I wanted to mention it here because some of those changes are going to become much more important as we lead forward into 2022 next year. All right, the last thing I wanted to mention here is Jupiter ingressing into Pisces at the very end of December of 2021 begins a very long transit, a year-long transit in 2022 of Jupiter moving into your 7th house of relationships. So if you have Virgo rising, then that automatically means that Pisces is your 7th house of relationships. And this could begin a very fruitful period of growth and development and expansion when it comes to either romantic relationships in your life or business partnerships and other types of one-on-one relationships that you have with specific individuals. So that looks like a pretty good and pretty optimistic transit, even though it doesn't begin until December. It doesn't begin in earnest until December of 2021. I wanted to mention it because there's going to be a little bit of a preview period earlier in the year in the second quarter of 2021 that you should pay attention to. So that preview period takes place starting on May 13th when Jupiter moves into Pisces, and it just sort of dips into that sign for a couple of months, moving in to Pisces for the first time in mid-May. Then Jupiter stations retrograde at, I think, 1 degree of Pisces on June 20th, which is the solstice. And then finally, Jupiter retrogrades out and moves back into Aquarius for the rest of the year, starting on July 28th. So it's just a 2-month period between mid-May and mid-July when Jupiter will dip into your 7th house, and you may see some new developments taking place in the sphere of relationships. So that could indicate new relationships starting at this time, or it could indicate a further development and a sort of confirmation and stabilization of existing relationships that makes them more permanent than they had been in the past. So pay attention to that preview period between May and July, because that's going to give you a lot of insight into the longer term Jupiter transit through your 7th house of relationships that's really going to start in earnest in December, starting on December 28th of 2021. So that's definitely something to look forward to and something to be optimistic about not just 2021, but also 2022. All right, I think that is it in terms of what I meant to focus on and touch on for this forecast for Virgo and Virgo rising for the entire year ahead of 2021. So thanks a lot for watching. Good luck this year, and I'll see you again next year for the forecast for 2022. Many of the images and calendars that were used in this episode are now available as posters on the astrologypodcast.com website. This includes our 2021 planetary alignments calendar, which shows all of the ingresses and retrogrades and lunations this year, the planetary movements calendar, which shows how far through the signs of the zodiac each of the planets will get during the course of 2021, and also other posters that we have, like our significations of the 12 houses poster, so that you can personalize and understand how each of these transits relates to your own birth chart. We also recently released our 2021 Auspicious Elections Full Year Ahead Electional Astrology Report, where Lisa Scheim and I went through each of the next 12 months and we picked out one lucky date, which would be good for launching new ventures and undertakings using the principles of electional astrology. So you can find out more about that report at chrisbrennanastrologer.com. Thanks to all the patrons that supported the production of this episode of the podcast through our page on Patreon. In particular, thanks to the patrons on our producers tier, including Nate Craddock, Marin Altman, Thomas Miller, Catherine Conroy, Michelle Marilot, Christy Moe, Ariana Amor, Mandy Ray, Angelique Nambo, Sumo Kopic, and Nadia Habhab. For more information about how to become a patron or have your name listed in the credits, please visit patreon.com/astrologypodcast. Also, special thanks to our sponsors, including the Northwest Astrological Conference, which is happening online May 27th through the 31st, 2021. Find out more information at norwac.net. The Mountain Astrologer magazine, which you can find out more information about at mountainastrologer.com. The ISAR Astrology Conference, happening August 18th through the 22nd, 2021. More information at isar2020.org. The Honeycomb Collective Personal Astrological Almanacs, which you can find out more information about at honeycomb.co. Also, the Portland School of Astrology, more information at portlandastrology.org. The AstroGold Astrology app, available for both iPhone and Android, available at astrogold.io. And finally, the primary software program that we use on episodes of the Astrology Podcast is called SolarFire Astrology Software, which is available at alabe.com, and you can get a 15% discount with the promo code AP15.